Okay, sexual reproduction, this would be the basics of primarily meiosis, but we'll hit a few of the highlights. Some organisms reproduce asexually. By mitosis, technically it's something, a little bit more simple than mitosis, but it doesn't require both a male and a female. So bacteria, for example, divide by binary fission, similar to mitosis. Like I said, the point is no sex cells are involved. Other organisms reproduce sexually by the combination of sex cells, which we have a fancy name for. They're called gametes. In the female, eggs or ova, and in the male, sperm. For suitable Christian wedding, we have an egg cell meeting a sperm cell, forming a zygote, the fertilized egg. Zygote. Can you say zygote? Many plant and animal species reproduce sexually using sex cells and specialized structures. I know it may be a stretch for you, but flowers are actually sex organs. Think of that the next time somebody hands you a flower. Slap them with it, maybe. So a lot of these structures, beautiful though that they are, have a function. Even the aroma of a flower is there just as much to attract insect pollinators as it may be to bring you pleasure. And you're going to, in this chapter, have to make sure you can recognize the boy parts, see this stamen, from the girl parts, this pistil. All right, and then we have parts that probably aren't either male or female, but have a function all the same in terms of maybe attracting pollinators, the color of flowers or the design of the flower itself, allowing certain birds or insects to pollinate them. So think of a lot of plants as having sex lives just like animals. Scary thought, I know. So the key ideas in this chapter are that meiosis, not mitosis, meiosis is the process that produces these sex cells, gametes. Sexual reproduction involves the joining of genetic material from two parents. Sexual reproduction creates the incredible diversity. Now that's an important one. If we simply relied on mitosis, asexual means of reproduction, we would all be clones and there would be no diversity at all. So yeah, that is a very important function, and there's a lot of reasons why diversity is important. We'll mention a few of them going along in this chapter. So here we go. The advantages and disadvantages, there's both, to both asexual and sexual reproduction. This is a key item, I would say, in this chapter. Be sure you can actually list some of the advantages as well as the disadvantages to both of these. Organisms use a variety of strategies to ensure the success of sexual reproduction. Otherwise, most species would die out unless we had some means of making this a success. Scientists have used their knowledge of sexual and asexual reproduction to develop reproductive technologies. More to be said momentarily. Let's move on to 3.1, the beginning. Cells such as muscle cells, skin cells, they are somatic. They are body cells, in contrast to germ cells or sex cells, which are not somatic. So these cells happen to be known as diploid. Di means two, because they possess a complete set of chromosomes. We say they are 2N. Cells, on the other hand, such as sperm and egg, are called gametes, and they're haploid because they have half the number of chromosomes. We say they're N. Diploid is 2N, haploid is N. So the egg, haploid, sperm, haploid, come together, fertilization, zygote, diploid. So meiosis is a specialized form of cell division that produces haploid gametes from diploid parent cells. Look at all the nice vocabulary you get in this chapter. Be able to diagram something like this, because this actually shows, let's say we start with an organism with 8 chromosomes, goes through one division, it still has 8. By the time you get through meiosis 1 and meiosis 2, you have 4 daughter cells. Notice that these daughter cells have half as many chromosomes as the parents. They are haploid. In 3.2, we look at the cell structures involved in cell division. During fertilization, a haploid egg cell from one parent and a haploid sperm cell from another parent fuse. That means comes together to produce a diploid zygote. Each parent contributes half of a complete set of chromosomes to the zygote. And there you have a sweet little diagram showing you what is happening during fertilization. Good word to know, fertilization. Alleles, now there's a nice new word for you, are different forms of a particular gene that when combined can produce a variety of traits. Remember we were saying that sexual reproduction has the advantage of diversity. Diversity matters. One of the reasons or ways you get diversity is because you have pairs of chromosomes at certain locations, which we call loci, on those chromosomes. These chromosomes are homologous. They're paired. They're the same chromosomes, but they're the opposite pair, right? So let's say we have a gene on this blue one that happens to be an allele for straight hairline, and then we have a gene at the same or similar location on the homologous chromosome that happens to code for a hairstyle called widow's peak. You should look that up. I think there's a picture of it in your textbook. You might even have that particular form, that gene. Those are alleles. Individuals produced as a result of sexual reproduction are different from each other and may be able to adapt better to a changing environment. See, now that's an important advantage of sexual reproduction. If we invent a scenario for humans, it's probably a little far-fetched. I'd have to get a little science fiction-ish. You might have watched a movie called Waterworld, and Waterworld, not a great movie, but the world is covered in water, and there happens to be an individual that for, let's say, a mutation or something, he has gills. So that particular adaptation makes him different. He has the genes for that particular expression of his genes, and that particular characteristic, if passed on, is actually an advantage for his offspring that would allow him to survive, right? So it's a little bit easier to find examples in the plant kingdom and whatnot. So another advantage, asexually reproducing organisms tend to produce many offsprings quickly. Sexually reproducing organisms tend to produce fewer offspring more slowly. So if I own a greenhouse, I am not going to go through the full sexual cycle to reproduce my plants for sale. I'm going to take cuttings and I'm going to take little bits and stick them in the ground and have like 25 plants thanks to one sacrificial plant, and that's going to happen very quickly compared to what happens with a sexually producing organism. By the way, you might have noticed in this vocabulary that you have certain alleles which are dominant and certain that are recessive. If you have a dominant allele, it's usually denoted with a capital letter. It tends to express itself. So if you have, let's say, a gene for brown hair and an allele for black hair, black may in fact be dominant. And I shouldn't have been pointing to dominant because the dominant gene would actually express itself, dominant allele. So, methods of sexual reproduction. Some unicellular organisms use conjugation to exchange genetic material. Almost sounds like sexual reproduction. But conjugation in bacteria, their DNA isn't in a nucleus because they're prokaryotic. Their DNA genetic material is in a circular chromosome nucleoid region and something called a plasmid. And what happens is they just form a mating bridge and exchange that genetic information when the cell splits. Now they both have that same genetic information. So hermaphrodites are organisms that have both male and female reproductive organs on the same individual. Many aquatic animals and flowering plants are hermaphrodites. Most animals, on the other hand, have separate sexes. External fertilization usually occurs among organisms living in aquatic environments. Think of Mr. Salmon, who basically releases a cloud of sperm into the water over top of where the female has deposited eggs. Fertilization tends to be very hit and miss, obviously, in the water, but that's why you have maybe more eggs. And on the other hand, land animals, an adaptation here for living on land is that fertilization actually takes place internally. And again, you're going to need to know these parts of the flower. Could you draw a flower and actually label these structures? You're going to do a little dissection of a flower or two. So while you're doing that, make sure you are looking for some of these structures. 3.4, back to the cell cycle. After fertilization, the zygote divides and becomes an embryo. So this is actually the developing organism. The embryos of nearly all mammals develop inside the mother. For plants, the zygote or fertilized egg is called a seed, which contains the embryo as well as stored food. For egg-laying animals, the eggs that are laid contain the zygote, nutrients, and a protective covering, such as a shell, gel-like covering, or an egg case. So there's your egg. Somehow if I thought my eggs were fertilized and I knew what was inside them, I would probably like them a lot less, but eggs are an incredibly good source of protein, so don't worry about what's inside that there egg. You know, you can't see it anyways, and chances are your eggs aren't fertilized anyways, right? So, on the other hand, inside an animal like a human, the embryo develops inside. The uterus is attached to the mother through the placenta, and the nutrients are exchanged through the umbilical cord. So, as this embryo develops, it's getting rid of its waste into the mother's circulation and taking nutrients from the mother through her circulation as well. So that might explain a couple of things about pregnancy. It might explain why mothers have to be very, very careful about what they're ingesting, especially things like alcohol, drugs, because that circulation is shared with the fetus. Right. We will, again, have you dissect a seed. Make sure you recognize and be able to draw the parts of a seed. Seeds are amazing structures. Most of the world relies on seeds for their food supply. I mean, rice, grains, very important structures. A lot of energy in them. Reproductive technologies in agriculture. A lot of people survive because of what farmers do, agriculture does, and agriculture is a huge industry in the world and very important. So these are some of the technologies or the applications of scientific principles to actually making reproduction more effective. So something called selective breeding is used to produce desirable traits in plants and animals. If I had a cow and I had a dairy farm, I would take those cows that produce the most milk and I would make sure that they were the ones that had babies for my farm, because I'm not going to take the cow that only produces 500 milliliters of milk every month when I can have a cow passing on a gene that is going to allow its offspring to have far more volume of milk. The product is money, right? So vegetative reproduction techniques are used to produce plants faster. This would be things like taking cuttings. Artificial insemination and in vitro fertilization. This is like fertilization in glass. Test tube babies. Obviously, we're not talking about human babies here, but plants, etc., can be reproduced artificially, or at least fertilized. Fish hatcheries increase the number of fertilized eggs. And then there's something called recombinant DNA technology used to produce, say, some drugs for humans. Things like insulin used to be taken from the pancreases of horses. And guess how many horses die per year and how many pancreases get sacrificed just to get a few drops of insulin. Insulin was incredibly expensive. We now take the gene for insulin from a human cell and we put it back into bacteria, and now the bacteria produces the insulin. Price comes down, a much more effective way. There's a lot of drugs being produced through recombinant. It just simply means a combination of genes from two different organisms, in this case human and bacteria. You've seen pictures of glow-in-the-dark mice. You've seen pictures of trees glow-in-the-dark because they have the gene from fireflies. Kind of cool stuff on the horizon. Some genetically modified organisms called GMOs may have desirable traits, but since they contain DNA from other organisms, their existence raises moral and ethical concerns. Yeah. Golden rice out there. Is it really just rice? A whole lot of vegetables are made to look better, fruit look better, because they contain certain genes that, yeah, make them look better. They're genetically modified. Again, this is like a lot of the issues with DNA. There are moral and ethical concerns. Is it right to mess with that original code? What do you think? This diagram, the last one in the package, I think I made the mistake of attaching it to 2 of your packages. Feel free to do it once. I was going to write this out for you. In this row, you'll label the actual stages. Realize in meiosis you have meiosis 1 and meiosis 2. You end up with 4 haploid daughter cells, but this first stage is almost like mitosis. But after mitosis, you then enter one more cycle so that these chromatids are actually separated. And you know what? I'm going to let you label those. Bottom line would be an explanation. Top line is just a name, right? I think you can get that right out of the textbook. So in the process of you looking at that and putting it in your own words, that's where learning occurs, right? So it's a good thing.